Sometimes a political crisis doesn't begin with explosions or breaking news. Sometimes it begins with silence, the kind of silence that settles over a region and makes ordinary people wonder what their leaders are no longer willing to say. In towns across Tanzania, mothers still walk past checkpoints to buy bread. Elderly men sit outside their homes, listening to the radio in the early morning, hoping to hear reassurance after weeks of unrest. And yet, on the day when reassurance was needed the most, a different kind of message arrived not in words, but in what was left unsaid. During a high-level SADC virtual summit led by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, one question rose quietly in the background. How deep must a leader fall before their neighbors act like they don't exist anymore? It's a troubling question, but it perfectly captures the atmosphere that hovered over President Samia Suluhu Hassan and her government after Tanzania's violent post-election crisis. Every leader on that screen had their moment. Malawi was congratulated for a peaceful transition. Madagascar was offered sympathy for its turmoil. But when it came to Tanzania, the silence became almost deafening. For a region built on unity, solidarity, and mutual respect, silence can be more powerful than condemnation. Silence can mean we saw what happened and we refuse to pretend it's normal. And for Tanzania, once considered one of East Africa's most stable nations, being ignored by its closest neighbors may be the harshest diplomatic message yet. As viewers, especially those who have followed African politics for decades, you know how rare it is for SADC to isolate a member state. So the real question becomes, what pushed Tanzania to this point, and what does this silence mean for the region's future? If you've been following these developments, or if you believe African stability matters as much as global safety, stay with me. And please consider sharing this video so more people can understand what truly happened behind that quiet but historic SADC moment. In the hours before the SADC Summit began, life across East and Southern Africa looked deceptively ordinary. Traders opened stalls, buses rumbled through dusty roads, and families gathered around radios because whenever SADC meets, ordinary people expect clarity, reassurance, and a steadying hand, especially during turbulent times. But this particular meeting, hosted virtually and chaired by South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, was different from the start. It was born out of crisis, not routine. Madagascar had plunged into violent unrest, its leadership shaken, its civilian deaths rising. As a result, South Africa had to step in and serve as interim chair after Madagascar became unable to fulfill its role. On that screen, the familiar leaders appeared one by one. Emmerson Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe, Professor Peter Mutharika of Malawi, King Mzwati III of Eswatini, senior ministers from across the region. And seated quietly among them was Emmanuel Nchimbi, Tanzania's vice president, representing a country still dealing with shockwaves after a 98% election victory, widely condemned as neither free nor peaceful. When President Ramaphosa began speaking, the tone was solemn but deliberate. His words touched on themes SADC prides itself on: unity, stability, shared responsibility. He spoke of the age-long regional gains that must be protected. He warned that the region was confronting profound but not terminal challenges. His emphasis on solidarity sounded like the kind of message a leader sends when the house is shaking and someone has to hold the walls steady. Then came the moment that changed everything. Ramaphosa formally congratulated Malawi's President Peter Mutharika, acknowledging his recent electoral win and wishing him success. He offered condolences to Madagascar, whose citizens had suffered during recent protests and violence. He even emphasized the need for SADC to act with urgency and foresight in stabilizing troubled member states. But when it came to Tanzania, there was nothing. Not a sentence, not a diplomatic courtesy, not even the polite minimum that SADC typically extends to every leader, even during times of controversy. Vice President Nchimbi remained visible on camera, listening, waiting, perhaps anticipating at least a symbolic acknowledgement of President Samia Suluhu Hassan's re-election. But as Ramaphosa continued reading from his prepared remarks, it became unmistakably clear Tanzania had been intentionally omitted. For diplomatic circles, such an omission is never accidental. It is a message delivered through restraint, a message that says, we cannot endorse what happened in your election. We cannot pretend the bloodshed did not occur. We cannot congratulate power built on violence. After addressing Malawi and Madagascar, Ramaphosa moved on to the wider agenda. He thanked the Secretariat for preparing documents. He affirmed SADC's commitment to peace and cooperation. He declared the session officially open. Still nothing about Tanzania. For many viewers, especially those used to the polished choreography of African regional politics, this omission felt jarring. SADC leaders rarely criticize each other openly. Even when elections are disputed, SADC often uses soft language phrases like encourage dialogue or urge calm. But silence. Silence is louder. By the time Ramaphosa concluded, analysts and diplomats watching the broadcast began sending messages to one another. Did you notice he skipped Tanzania? That is not normal. Someone made a deliberate choice. And for the Tanzanian delegation, the silence felt even heavier. Their country had hoped to use this summit to rebuild its damaged credibility. Instead, the very platform that could have offered validation turned into the stage where Tanzania's isolation became painfully visible. It was a diplomatic earthquake disguised as a routine meeting. A message delivered without a single direct word. A moment that would soon ignite discussion across the entire region and far beyond. As the SADC meeting ended, the region slipped into the quiet of early evening. In Dar es Salaam, street vendors were still packing up their stalls. In Arusha, young men huddled around their phones scrolling through news feeds. Most of them had not watched the summit live, but within minutes, a new kind of noise erupted, not from gunfire or sirens, but from millions of keyboards across the region. The first wave of reactions came from political observers in South Africa and Malawi. Then, Tanzanians in the diaspora joined. Soon, the silence that Ramaphosa had delivered spread like wildfire. Every tweet, every post, every comment, circling around one central shock. Why did he congratulate everyone except Tanzania? One commentator wrote, "I have just listened to the broadcast by President Ramaphosa. What stands out is he congratulated Malawi's president, but not Madame Dictator of Tanzania, who slaughtered thousands to stay in power. That silence says everything." Another person added, "OECD is sending a message. They cannot speak it openly, but they have spoken." The tone of the online discussion quickly escalated. At first, it was disbelief, then indignation. Finally, it hardened into a consensus. Tanzania had been deliberately sidelined. Videos from the summit were replayed and clipped into 10-second snippets showing the moment Ramaphosa congratulated Malawi, then immediately shifted topics without mentioning Suluhu. Hashtags in Swahili and English appeared, translating roughly to Tanzania ignored diplomatic silence and justice for protest victims. For many ordinary Tanzanians, especially those who had lived through the post-election violence, the reactions felt validating. They had watched loved ones die, seen neighborhoods filled with checkpoints and military patrols, and endured weeks of uncertainty. For them, SADC's silence was the first sign that the world had noticed what they had been forced to live through. But for the Tanzanian government, the pressure quickly became unbearable. Inside the vice president's office, advisors scrambled to prepare a response. Emmanuel Nchimbi, who had sat through the entire meeting visibly tense, was now expected to reassure SADC, reassure Tanzania, and reassure the world. It was an impossible task. When he finally spoke, his message was simple and practiced. Calm has been restored. Life has returned to normal. The government has stabilized the situation, but the words sounded out of place beside the lived reality on the ground. Reports of arrests, nighttime raids, and checkpoints still circulated widely. Foreign media outlets challenged his statements. Activists mocked them. Even diplomats quietly expressed doubts. And the moment Nchimbi finished speaking, another blow arrived. SADC, rattled by the online backlash, issued a late-night statement, a statement that only deepened Tanzania's embarrassment. For the first time since the summit, SADC acknowledged the deadly unrest, not just in Madagascar but explicitly in Tanzania. The statement read, "Summit extends its sincere condolences to the families who lost loved ones during the protests that occurred in the Republic of Madagascar and more recently in the United Republic of Tanzania." But this phrasing created more problems than it solved. It grouped Tanzania with a country undergoing military turmoil. It admitted casualties that Tanzania had tried to downplay, and it contradicted Nchimbi's insistence that order has returned. Online, the reactions to the statement were immediate. Too little, too late. SADC was shamed into speaking. How can they express condolences when Tanzania still denies the killings? Political analysts across southern Africa began going on radio and TV programs explaining that SADC had been cornered. They hadn't wanted to confront Tanzania openly, but the public forced their hand, and by issuing condolences they confirmed what many suspected: the region did not believe Suluhu's narrative. As night fell across southern Africa, one truth became clear. The silence that began inside a diplomatic meeting had now become a storm of public pressure, a storm of regional scrutiny, a storm that Tanzania's government could no longer contain, no matter how many reassurances they attempted. It was the turning point when a carefully staged summit turned into a political earthquake that the whole continent could feel. In the days following the SADC Summit, the consequences of that diplomatic silence began to settle across Tanzania like a heavy fog. On the streets of Dar es Salaam, families still searched for missing relatives. Mothers waited in hospital corridors hoping for updates that never came. From Mwanza to Morogoro, people whispered the same question. If SADC will not acknowledge our government, what does that mean for us? The human cost of the post-election violence remained unmistakable. Reports, some verified, many whispered, spoke of thousands killed or disappeared. Entire neighborhoods carried the trauma of nighttime raids. Checkpoints remained on major roads where soldiers scrutinized ID cards and questioned travelers. For civilians, movement was no longer a right. It was a risk. These were not isolated incidents. They formed a pattern that made SADC's silence feel less like an insult to the government and more like a grim recognition of what ordinary Tanzanians had endured. But the political consequences cut even deeper. Inside Tanzania's ruling circles, the summit's outcome sparked unease. A government already struggling to control the narrative now found itself watched more closely than ever. Diplomats privately admitted that losing symbolic recognition at a regional level was a blow unlike anything they had faced since the country's early post-independence years. Tanzania had always been the quiet pillar of East Africa, steady, predictable, respected. Suddenly, it was the subject of whispered doubts, and those doubts spread quickly. Foreign investors began requesting additional security reports before releasing funds. Some suspended planned travel. Aid organizations noted an uptick in restrictions and delays. Embassies, especially Western ones, tightened their movement guidelines for staff and citizens. The most direct warning came from the United States Embassy in Dar es Salaam. Its statement was blunt unusually, so, for diplomatic language, heavy security presence persists nationwide. Movement restrictions and checkpoints remain active. Foreign nationals may face increased attention from security forces. There have been reports of temporary detentions. To the Tanzanian public, these words cut deeply. They confirmed what many had been saying for weeks: the country was not under control. Life had not returned to normal. The government's reassurances were not believed, not by the citizens who lived through the violence and not by the international community observing from afar. Politically, the situation grew more volatile. Opposition groups, though still fearful after the crackdown, gained renewed moral ground as SADC's silence and the U.S. warning offered validation. Activists began organizing small, cautious gatherings. Lawyers prepared petitions. Clergy members quietly urged reconciliation. But the government, cornered by regional embarrassment and domestic unrest, doubled down on authority. New checkpoints appeared overnight. More surveillance, more roadblocks. In the countryside, rumors spread that soldiers were patrolling villages long after the election wounds should have begun healing. SADC's decision to omit Tanzania had become more than a diplomatic signal. It had become a mirror reflecting the nation's internal fracture. For many Tanzanians, the summit's silence forced an uncomfortable realization: even their regional neighbors no longer trusted what the government said. And this deepened the most dangerous tension of all: the widening gap between the people's lived reality and the government's official narrative. Across the country, the mood shifted from fear to uncertainty. And uncertainty in a fragile post-election environment can be as destabilizing as any act of violence. In the quiet early hours of a new day, long before the sun rose over Washington or Brussels, Tanzanian families were already lining up at checkpoints, some trying to reach work, others hoping to reunite with loved ones detained in the chaos of recent weeks. And while these everyday struggles continued on the ground, a very different kind of assessment was taking shape thousands of miles away. The United States was the first major power to speak openly and bluntly. Its embassy in Dar es Salaam issued an alert that many diplomats privately admitted was unusually severe for a longtime partner of Tanzania. The wording was unmistakable: heavy security presence nationwide, movement restrictions and checkpoints. Foreign nationals may experience increased attention from security forces, reports of temporary detentions. For Washington, this was not merely a travel advisory. It was a political signal, a signal that the U.S. government did not accept the narrative that Tanzania was back to normal. In diplomatic language, such a warning is equivalent to telling the world: we see instability, we see risk, and we do not trust the reassurances being given. American analysts on foreign policy networks echoed the same sentiment. They pointed out that Tanzania, once considered a reliable and predictable actor, was now showing patterns seen in states descending into prolonged instability. Commentators noted that even during contested elections in East Africa's past, the U.S. rarely used such stringent language. But America was not alone. Across the Atlantic, European capitals also began adjusting their tone. The United Kingdom quietly updated its travel advisories, citing concerns about the volatile security environment. Germany and the Netherlands expressed alarm to their citizens about continued reports of violence and detentions. Though more measured than Washington's response, the European statements carried the same underlying message: democratic legitimacy in Tanzania was now in question. Meanwhile, regional observers, especially in East Africa, concluded that Tanzania's crisis had now become internationalized. Kenyan and Ugandan media outlets ran headlines asking whether Tanzania risked becoming the new regional flashpoint. Commentators warned that instability in Tanzania could ripple through trade routes, border towns, and refugee pathways. At the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, diplomats were divided. Some argued that SADC's silence toward Tanzania was a necessary wake-up call. Others worried that isolating Suluhu's government would push it deeper into defensive behavior, potentially worsening the humanitarian situation. But even among those sympathetic to Tanzania, no one could deny that the country had become a source of regional unease. For global observers, what happened at the SADC Summit symbolized something larger: a shift in how African regional bodies respond to crises. The era of automatic solidarity, where member states defended each other regardless of circumstances, appeared to be fading. The fact that SADC omitted Tanzania and the United States followed with a stark security alert suggested a growing willingness by international actors to challenge electoral abuses and state-led violence. And in conversations around Africa's future, comparisons quietly emerged. Many pointed out that while countries like Burkina Faso under President Ibrahim Traoré were gaining respect for openly confronting instability and asserting sovereignty, Tanzania was now facing questions about transparency, accountability, and democratic integrity. In the global diplomatic arena, perception shapes reality. And right now, the world's perception of Tanzania is one of a nation struggling politically, morally, and structurally to regain the trust it once enjoyed. As the echoes of the SADC Summit fade, one truth remains impossible to ignore: silence can be louder than condemnation. Tanzania did not hear harsh words. It did not face public reprimand. Instead, it was met with something far more devastating in the world of diplomacy: being treated as if it no longer existed. For ordinary Tanzanians, this moment signals a new chapter, one defined not just by what their government says, but by what their neighbors refuse to say. And for regional leaders, the SADC Summit has drawn a quiet line in the sand. There are limits to how far a nation can descend into violence before the region begins to distance itself in ways that are unmistakable. But the deeper warning is for all of Africa. Tanzania's crisis is not isolated. Many African nations face the same pressures: contested elections, public distrust, economic strain, and governments increasingly willing to use force when legitimacy weakens. The question now is whether SADC's silence will become a model of how future crises are handled: discreet but firm, quiet but cutting. And this moment forces us to look beyond Tanzania. Across Africa today, different leaders are taking different roads. Some cling to old systems of control. Others build new paths rooted in sovereignty and public trust. Conversations around political integrity, citizen safety, and regional unity are shifting quietly but powerfully. It's in this climate that names like Burkina Faso and President Ibrahim Traoré continue to rise across Africa news platforms, often symbolizing a different approach, one that prioritizes accountability, public safety, and national dignity. For many across the continent, Tanzania's silence at the summit stands in sharp contrast to the assertiveness seen in other parts of Africa's political landscape. But the final and most important question is not for presidents or diplomats. It's for you. Do you believe Tanzania can rebuild trust with its neighbors? Is this silence a one-time signal or the beginning of a deeper regional shift toward holding leaders accountable? And what does it mean for Africa's future if regional bodies start speaking through omission rather than support? Your voice matters, especially now when silence has become one of the most powerful tools in African diplomacy. If you care about the stability of Africa, if you believe truth is more important than political convenience, If you think leaders must answer to the people they govern, then please share this video. And subscribe if you believe that honest conversations about Tanzania, about Burkina Faso, about President Ibrahim Traoré, and about Africa's future deserve a place beyond the headlines.